Welcome all to the lecture named What is React Native? In this lecture, I'll be giving a brief overview of what is React Native and what problem does it solve for us. So let's get started. React Native, as per its documentation, it specifies itself as a framework for designing mobile applications. As we are living in the mobile world, we know exactly what is meant by mobile application. However, I'm going to give you a few examples. So using React Native, you can design mobile applications like Facebook application, which you might already have in your mobile phones, or like WhatsApp application, which is again a part of a mobile platform. So using React Native, you can design any application that can be run on the mobile world. So the next question you might be thinking is, okay, fine, React Native promises me to design and deploy my idea of application into the mobile world, but there are two platforms, right? Specifically iOS or Android. So the next question is, what platform does React Native support? Is it iOS or Android? And at the same time, you might be thinking, okay, boss, in order to design, deploy, or push any of the mobile application to App Store or iOS platform, you might be knowing, or even in order to develop the iOS application, you might be should have understanding of Swift or Objective-C. Without knowing this, you cannot push any of your mobile application into the iOS world. At the same time, Android has its own counterpart, which they call it as Java. So for Android, you need to know Java as a programming language in order to design your mobile application. So the next valid question is, what language should I use in React Native? To that question, the simple answer is JavaScript. And if you're scratching your head, only JavaScript? Yes, again I'm going to repeat the answer for the same question. It's JavaScript. So now we can define React Native in a more understandable way, such a way that you can write in React Native using JavaScript, and the resulting application is going to run in both Android and as well as in iOS without any change in the source code. And that is the whole benefit that React Native is giving to mobile developers. Fortunately or unfortunately, there is another mobile world called Windows, but React Native as of date 25th September 2015, it's not supporting it. The key takeaway is React Native, you should be knowing only JavaScript, and you write JavaScript code and everything will be taken care of by React Native, and you can run your resulting code in both iOS as well as in Android. And few other information about React Native. It's been open source project by Facebook, and React Native is built on another idea or another framework which is already in the market, which have already gained popularity among the web developers, which they call it as a React. So since React Native is built on top of that idea, we should be having or even understanding what is React. Okay, so and that is the whole idea of the next lecture. Okay, so in this next lecture we'll be seeing what is React and how React Native got its intuitive idea of writing your mobile application in JavaScript that is going to be running in both Android as well as in iOS is all about in the next lecture. Thank you guys. Welcome all to this lecture named React versus React Native. In this lecture, I'm going to give the key differentiate between React framework and as well as React Native framework. At the same time, I'm going to introduce a new concept called JSX, which is going to be the same for React and as well as React Native. So let's get started. So React is a framework that has been designed and developed by keeping web developers in mind. Using React, you can develop web application. So you can put React is for web application. Whereas React Native, as I was explaining in my previous lecture, it's for mobile application. Okay. So React is supported by JavaScript and JSX. Obviously, in order to design any web-based application, you should be using JavaScript for sure. But Facebook guys have come up with a new terminology called JSX, which I'll be explaining in some moment. So React Native is also going to be the same technology stack. React Native can be written using JavaScript and as well as using JSX. So I'll explain what is JSX is. So JSX is an expression language that allows developers to write HTML fragment code into their JavaScript file. If you have any prior knowledge on web development, you can very well see that a JavaScript file cannot have a HTML syntax or HTML code, right? Typically, all HTML code will be wrapped up in a separate file with an extension .html and JavaScript file with an extension .js. To make that point clear, let me open up inspect element, okay, which might open up the console for me. Yes. So in the console, I can type any JavaScript, something like var of a is equal to creating an object, right? So this is a valid JavaScript, but I cannot type HTML/HTML. It's going to throw me an exception saying that, this is not a valid syntax of JavaScript, right? Because this is a valid syntax of HTML. Since console is going to execute all your snippets in JavaScript engine, this is not at all a valid syntax according to the JavaScript engine. So the idea is using JSX, you can mix both as well as, meaning both your HTML and as well as JavaScript. So that's what your .js file now will be containing both HTML code as well as JavaScript code. Okay, so a very simple example of that terminology is shown here in the small code snippet. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to mix up both your HTML code and as well as JavaScript code, your file extension should be .jsx, not .js. Okay, as you can see in this code, this guy is a valid HTML, right? And whereas this guy is right, like document.getElementById is a valid JavaScript call. As you can see, now both HTML and as well as JavaScript code is combined and they call it as .jsx. Now how React or even React Native works is the .jsx file will be given to React, and then React parses this file and sees that, okay, I am seeing something which the developer have given it as an HTML tag. I'm going to create a HTML tag for him. Note that clearly, now React is creating the DOM for us by inspecting your or parsing your .jsx code. Whereas in other web development mode, you will be creating your DOM elements, which is nothing but your HTML elements, in a separate file called .html, which when opened by the browser is obviously will be rendered by the browser. Whereas in React, the case is a bit different. React is going to parse your .jsx and going to create the DOM in behalf of for you. Okay, by the same way of create and maintaining the DOM that is taken care by the React has a separate concept called virtual DOM. Okay, so all your .jsx will be parsed and React will be first pushing the DOM structure that you have given in your .jsx to what it is called as virtual DOM. From virtual DOM, it's going to push into the real DOM, which the browser can understand. Okay, so we need to understand what is virtual DOM in order to proceed further with React Native in depth. Okay, so we'll see what is virtual DOM in the next lecture. Thank you. Welcome guys to this lecture named What is Virtual DOM? In this lecture, I'm going to continue with our previous lecture discussion on how React has its own DOM and what are the benefits out of it. Let's get started. This is the previous code snippet that I was discussing with you guys in the previous lecture. Okay, imagine this code snippet is given to the React component. Okay, React parses this file and it sees that there is an HTML element. In its own term, we call it as .jsx. Sorry, JSX element, right? So React parses this and converts this to a node, a DOM node. Okay. Now React, instead of going and directly painting this to the browser, it goes and keeps in its own DOM, which they call it as a virtual DOM. Okay, so React has its own virtual DOM. An important point to keep in mind over here is the virtual DOM, which is owned by React, is not as same as the browser DOM, which will make you to think that so whenever there is a change in the virtual DOM, React needs to re-render the real DOM in itself, right? So React decides that in itself, meaning React decides when to re-render the real DOM. Okay, so an important point in this flow to keep in mind here is the virtual DOM and the DOM will always be in sync, but the flow goes like this, not like this. Whenever it sees the DOM element, React pushes that to first virtual DOM, and then later point in time React sees that there is a need to directly push the element to the DOM. Probably someone in the code would have called render method, which will obviously goes and displays the myDiv element on the browser DOM. So React sees that, okay, the programmer have called render method for this particular component, so I'm going to pick that component from my virtual DOM and I'm going to paint the DOM on the real browser DOM. Okay, now in this point you might be thinking why React is overcomplicating things, why React has its own virtual DOM, what are the advantages of it? So to give the advantages of why React has its own virtual DOM, let us consider a scenario. Let us consider there are 1000 div elements that are being rendered by the browser, okay, at a given time t1. At a given time t2, imagine that one of those 1000 div elements got changed, and typically before React, other technologies, what it will happen is instead of re-rendering those only changed element, the browser will go on repainting the all other 1000 elements, which is affecting the performance. And that is the whole point. React says that, okay, fine, I'll be having my own DOM called virtual DOM, where I'll keep track of the DOM at any given time frame. That is the whole point. Okay, the same scenario with React, how it will work is React first parses 1000 div elements. Imagine that we have 1000 div elements, okay, and it creates its virtual DOM, okay, and someone calls react.render on those 1000 elements, and React sees, okay, from virtual DOM I'm going to push that to a real DOM. That's fine. At time t2, out of 1000 elements, one div element got changed. That will be notified to React. React will push the changes to virtual DOM. Now virtual DOM has the previous state also. Now what React brilliantly does over here is React now computes the difference between those two DOM elements at the two given time frames. Now React, after this computation, comes to know that, okay, out of 1000 elements, only one of the div element is going to have changed. So what I'll do is I'll update only that affected element to the real DOM. That is the whole point of React introducing its own virtual DOM, and that is the whole point everyone on the web calling React as a super performance web-based application framework, right? So that's it with this flow. It might sound a bit in depth, but you'll get used to it as we progress through the course. So the next lecture is how does React Native uses the virtual DOM in order to create mobile application. Okay, see you guys. Thank you. Welcome to the lecture named The Implications of Native. In this lecture, I'm going to explain what we term it as native in React Native world, and we'll see how React Native comes up with its own new component for mobile specific world. So before we get started, let me revisit the flow diagram that I was explaining you in the previous lecture. Okay, one of the key difference that we need to understand from React and as well as React Native is that the JSX file is going to be different. For example, React as a framework for web application supports the JSX for DOM elements. Agreed. But if you think logically, React Native doesn't need to support those DOM elements because React Native is going to be run on the mobile platforms, either iOS or Android, right? Instead, what React Native says that, okay, I'm not going to support DOM elements at all because React Native's goal is to provide an environment to run on mobile platforms. So I'm going to provide the components which are very specific to mobile platform. So there are a lot of components which React Native is bundled by default. Two of such component that I have mentioned over in my slide. One of first is view. So this view component is very specific to your mobile platform view. Okay, so probably if you own an iOS phone, whatever you see currently on the screen is a view, right? So this view is nothing but representing that view either in iOS or in Android. Okay, similarly the date picker iOS, as the name suggests, this is directly mapping to your date picker that is coming up while you're using your iPhone any application. Okay, so React Native provides a bunch of these or similar components which is very specific for mobile platforms. Okay, so now we'll answer why React is called native or React Native. Okay, so let me go back to this slide. Okay, let me walk through you a simple example. Now imagine a JSX file contains a view component, okay, and that view component or that JSX file which contains a view component is given to our React Native. React Native converts that into, as we know, something like virtual DOM, and then React Native asks the bridge, hey bridge, the project author have asked to run the JSX code in iOS. Can you convert my virtual DOM which has some internal state which represents the view itself to very specific to iOS? Okay, now the interesting point that is going to happen over here is Bridge says, okay, React Native, I know what you're speaking about. I know how to handle the view component that you are asking about. Since you are asking the view component for iOS, I'll convert the view component that is written in JSX into a specific UI view which the iOS can understand. Okay, if you note down the process clearly, we are converting the JSX component like view into something iOS specific UI view. Okay, similarly, if the case is to be running with Android, the same view file or the view component will be converted into class view. Now keep in mind that the UI view that is got generated out of JavaScript is exactly the same UI view that you would require to write in Swift or Objective-C when you're going to develop the iOS application. The same case with Android as well. Okay, and this is the reason React is called React Native, because every JavaScript call or every your JSX component is converted exactly into the equivalent of your platform specific native calls, and that is the exact reason why React is called React Native. And that is one of the main reasons why React is much more popular than other frameworks like PhoneGap. PhoneGap, what it does is PhoneGap just allows the user to write some JavaScript code which will be running on a browser. And as you can guess, from the browser you cannot access a lot of your other phone's activities, and phone gap is very limited, and that is where React Native shines in or pitch in and says that, okay, even though you are going to develop the mobile application in JavaScript, I'm going to convert those calls into the native platform specific world, which is going to be running as fast as possible, and at the same time it is exactly the same call that the real languages like Swift or Objective-C or Java would provide, right? So that is the whole idea of React Native, and that is the whole hype React Native have got around it. Okay, and that is where this course is designed to help you guys to go through this process of using React Native successfully in your project for both iOS and as well as in Android. Okay, so we have answered this question. So end of this section. Okay, so great work, guys. We have done a good job. Actually, you have done a good job of listening to my lectures. Thanks for it. And the upcoming next lecture is setting up the environment, where, as the name suggests, we'll be setting up our machines in order to get our hands dirty on React Native examples and React Native hacks. Until then, see you. Bye. Welcome, guys, to the lecture name Installing React Native. In this lecture, I'm going to present you what all tools and what all dependencies are required for installing React Native. Let's get started. So one of the prerequisites of this course, or even for using React Native, is you should be having a computer with Mac OS X installed. The reason for it is React Native is supported only in Mac OS X, so you should be having one such operating system in your machine. So the first dependency that we are going to install for React Native is, they call it as Homebrew. So you should be running this command in terminal. Okay, so this one you have to run. Okay, I've already installed Brew software. Okay, so once you run this command, you should be able to see Brew on your command line argument. So make sure that after you run this command, this little Brew command is up and running on your command. Homebrew is a software for managing the packages or softwares in Apple world. So this will help you to install all other React dependencies very much easily. As React Native is completely built on top of Node, we should be installing Node as well. Once you have Brew, you should be running this command, brew install Node. Okay, so which will be executing a list of steps, and after that it will install the Node software. So once Node is installed, you should be able to see the Node command in your command prompt. Okay, so the next software that is required for React Native is, they call it as React Watchman. Okay, again this Watchman can be installed via Brew. So again the same command, you have to run it, brew install Watchman, and hit return key, which will be installing the Watchman software. The last and final dependencies for React Native is, they call it as Flow. Again, Flow is available in installation via Brew command. You have to run this brew install Flow. So once that is done, we are good to go to install the main React Native itself. Okay, so now instead of running Brew, you have to run npm. So I'll give a short intro. What is npm? Npm is a package manager for Node. Okay, so React Native CLI is one of the packages that is available in the Node world. Okay, whereas Flow or even for Watchman, they are available as a software for Mac. So installing the softwares for Mac is done via Brew, and installing the packages that are very specific to Node is done via npm, which they call it as Node Package Manager. So this is the final step for installing React Native. So you can go there and go to your terminal and install it. -G, make sure that you put it, because -G installs this command React Native globally, which means that you can run everywhere. Okay, so that is the final step for installing React Native. Once that is done, you should be having the command called React Native. So probably React Native hyphen version. Okay, so anyways, React Native is installed. Okay, and make sure that this is present in your machine. Okay, that's it with this lecture. Next lecture onwards, we'll get our hands dirty by start inspecting the real world React Native project, and we'll see what all tools are available in React Native world and how we can use those tools for getting most out of it. Thank you. Welcome all to this lecture named Tools Required. In this lecture, I'm going to explain what all tools are required in order to test and run our React Native projects. So there are actually two tools required to run React Native. The first one is Xcode, which should be of version 6.3 or higher. Okay, so this Xcode IDE or tool, whatever you call it as, is mandate for running React Native. The reason it is mandate is because I'm going to cover in this complete course running React Native in iOS platform. So in order to test and deploy our code in simulator, Xcode is and really a mandate tool. Probably you might have the latest Xcode. What you can do is you can open Xcode and go to Xcode, about Xcode, and check the version, and that version should be of 6.3 or higher. If not, you can go and grab your Xcode from Apple App Store and make sure you install it. The next tool is Sublime, which we'll be using for editing our JavaScript files, and obviously that is optional. I'm going to prefer Sublime text editor for this complete course, and if you feel you have any other alternative tools for JavaScript editing, feel free to use it, but I'm going to use Sublime text for this complete course. So it's completely optional which tool you prefer for JavaScript editing. You might not even require a tool. You can do JavaScript editing in text edit, the tool that has come by default in the Mac OS X systems. So these are the two required tools. As I said, Xcode is mandate and second one is optional. You can take the choices on. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to this lecture on set up your first React Native project. In this lecture, I'm going to walk through what all necessary steps is required in order to build the first sample project. Okay, I hope that you guys have already installed all the necessary tools and as well as the dependencies for React Native to run on Mac OS X. If not, I request you guys to watch section 2 where I have given the complete walkthrough on the installations. Okay, so first let us go and open the terminal. Okay, and let me create a directory. Probably I'll name it as learn React Native. Let me go into the directory. Okay, the directory is empty for now. So now let us go and first create our first React Native project. There are several ways of creating the React Native project, but one of the easiest way to create React Native project is to use React Native command that we have installed in our previous section. This command takes an argument called init, and the second argument it takes is the project name. Probably we'll name the project name as first project. If you press enter, React Native is going to walk through a lot of steps and it creates the necessary project structure for us. Keep in mind that the React Native project should be in the proper structure so that when we run the project in React Native, it can recognize and make a successful build. Okay, so in it, make sure that it bundles up the necessary project structure in behalf of you, and that is the whole benefit of using React Native's init command. Okay, it takes a bit of time. Okay, it updates and it makes all the necessary node modules and stuffs into your first project. Okay, so let us wait for a few more seconds by which React Native will complete its installation of our first project. It's still running. So in the meanwhile, what React Native init does is it's going to init both a standard Android project in React Native world and as well as standard iOS project in React Native world. Okay, so it's almost done. You could able to see in the console that it's created both folders for iOS as well as for Android with necessary stuffs in it. Okay, so everything the project requires in order to run in React Native world is set it up in behalf of you. Let me open up the file that is got created. Let me go here. Okay, now you can see that there are two directories. One is Android, which will be having Android specific stuffs, and another directory is called iOS, which will be having the project related stuffs for iOS. But there are two different files called index.android.js and index.ios.js. And as the name specifies, these two files we need to modify in order to run in either one of the platform. Okay. So, and another one is node modules, which has the necessary dependencies for React Native to run. So you no need to worry about it. React Native init command takes care of it. And package.jsn is nothing but a dependency management in npm. You can specify the necessary dependencies in a JSON format which npm will understand. However, I have a separate lecture on walkthroughing each of those in detail, but for now we are good to go that we have created our first project in React Native. The next lecture I'm going to cover how to run this sample project in Xcode. Okay, until then, see you guys. Welcome all to the lecture Run Your First Project in Xcode. In previous lecture, we have used React Native's inbuilt init command to create an project for us. In this lecture, I'm going to show how to exactly run that project in Xcode. So let us open up the directory that React Native created for us in the previous lecture. Okay, let me go into the directory, and inside the directory you can see a folder name iOS. If you open that folder, you can see that React Native's init command have created an Xcode project for us. So without any ado, let me go and open up the first project.xcode project, which is going to be open in Xcode. Okay, so it got opened. Now we can go and directly run this project. Okay, let me click on run, which is going to open up two windows. One window is terminal, which has some text getting printed on it. I'll explain what this means. Another one is obvious and iOS simulator. Okay, as you can see, our first project is getting loaded in the iOS simulator. Okay, it's transforming few files. Okay, take a bit of time, and here we go. This is the first project that React Native have created in behalf of us. And as you can see, it just created a project which just displays a dummy text on the iOS screen. That text is nothing but welcome to React Native. And if you're very curious from where this text is coming from, let me show you where it is actually coming from. Let me minimize this one. Open dot. Let me go into the first project directory, and you can see the file named index.ios.js. Let me open that with Sublime. Okay, and this is the JavaScript file that React Native created for us. For now, do not worry about each and every details of this. I'm going to explain each and every detail in the upcoming lectures. But as you can see here, there is a text like welcome to React Native, which is what is getting printed in the iOS simulator. Now what we can do is we can go and change this guy into something else. Welcome to my course on Udemy by Ante. Let me save this and let me open up the iOS simulator. And in order to see the changes that we have done in the JS file, React Native says that you have to refresh only your iOS simulator rather than building it again. So open your iOS simulator, press Command R. As you can see, the changes have immediately been reflected on the iOS simulator. And here we go. The changes are now on the iOS screen. And you can feel how React Native makes things much easier. We have just made few line changes and press Command plus R and everything works out of the moon for us, right? So that's it. Now you have an understanding of how to open the project in Xcode and how to run it. In the next lecture, I'm going to explain what does Xcode opens up in the first place. When you click on the first time the start button of Xcode project, you would have noticed that a terminal gets opened up. I'm going to explain in the next lecture what is the terminal is for and how to use it. Okay, until then, see you guys. Welcome all to the lecture named Start and Stop React Native Server. In this lecture, I'm going to explain what is React Package Server is and how to start and stop manually. So let me go and run the same project again from the Xcode. I'm clicking on the run button. Okay. As the moment I click on the run button, before even the iOS simulator gets started, there is something called React Manager Terminal comes into the picture and your project is getting built and pushed into the iOS simulator. Now, this lecture explains the need or necessary for this terminal which is up and running. What if you close this guy and refresh your iOS simulator? Okay, now you can see that okay, something went wrong. It says socket got closed. In order to React Native to run your iOS project, it is mandatory that React Native should be starting its own server, which they call it as a packager server. If for some reason you have closed your React Native's server that got started from the Xcode, you have to start it manually again. How to start it is very straightforward. You have to go to the project root directory. I'm already in the project root directory and type npm start. This npm start will start the React Native's package server. I'll explain in a moment what it's meant by packager server. As you can see, it says packager is ready. Now we can go to the iOS simulator and do refresh your project. And now again we are back to the exact working product. Now what this packager does is very simple. As you could remember in my previous lecture, I was explaining how React converts your .js files into the very native specific iOS platform, and this is where the packager comes into the picture. The packager bundles or changes the .js files into something which your iOS can understand. So it is mandatory that you have to run the packager server whenever you are going to deploy your code in iOS simulator. If you're not going to run this, it won't be possible for React Native to push the necessary project in iOS simulator. So make sure that you run this either manually via npm start or directly from Xcode's run project. Either way should be fine, but understand that packager is the one which will be converting your .js files into something native of iOS platform. Make sure that you understand that, and in the next lecture I'm going to walk through the complete directory structure which we have got from React Native's init command, where I'll explain all in depth. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to this lecture named Understanding React Native by Code. In this lecture, I'm going to explain or walk through the code that is got generated when we hit React Native init command. So in this lecture, we'll be seeing the technical details of how React Native is working, and at the same time I'm going to make sure that you guys understand what happening behind the scenes when we run our project from Xcode. So let us open our project directory structure. Okay, so this is the project that we got created by using React Native init command. Let me open up that project. And as I've already explained, there is a file called index.ios.js, which is what is being published from JavaScript to iOS native code. So let me open up that file first in my Sublime text edit. Okay, and this is the file that looks like. So I'm going to walk through now the entire file explaining how React Native have built that sample application that we have seen in the previous lecture. Okay, so as you can see and as you can understand JavaScript, you can see that there are two objects. Okay, function object is being generated by React Native code. First one, they call it as first project itself because that is what we have given our project name. And that first project is being created by a special method called, what they call it as react.create class. This react.create class is creating the component of React Native. Okay, what I mean by that is every technical thing in React Native should be of a component. Okay, and React Native says that I'm going to expose a public API which I call it as react.create class, by using which you can create that specific components. And out of that component there is a method called render, which the React Native will be calling when it's binding this to the iOS view. Inside the rendered method, as you can see that there is a very similar code like HTML that got presented in our source file. Okay, now if you try to read this syntax, which is nothing but JSX itself, we can understand that okay, React Native have provided few things like view, text, and many other things which will be directly converted to native specific code, as I was explaining in the previous lecture. So in this case, when we have created our first project by React Native init command, React have said that okay, I'm going to create a view which is going to be a parent tag. Okay, and out of that parent tag there will be 3 children which will be of type text. And if you note it clearly that these views and text are coming clearly from React Native's framework or library. Okay, now in order to compare this with the running application, let me open up the Xcode and run the project. And our iOS simulator is getting loaded. Okay, forget about this one. Let me go to the code base. Okay, so you can see now if you compare the renderer method with the resulting UI view, you can directly map each of the every line in render method. What I mean by that is, as I was technically saying, React Native have created a view component which is a parent component for all the views in React Native, and it also created 3 child text components. Now if you compare this with the resulting code, you can exactly see that okay, the whole view of this iOS application right now is be coming from this view tag, and out inside this view tag you can see there are 3 text contents. The first text content is nothing but this guy. As you can see, the text is exactly mapping to this one, and the second text content is nothing but this guy, and similarly for the third text content. Now you might be thinking that these two text contents view or how it is represented on the screen is completely different from this one. What I mean by that is, welcome to my course on Udemy by Anto text is completely in bold. How that can be possible? Then React says the answer for that is, okay, you have to create a style sheet for all your view elements if you want to come up with your own appearance of look and feel. For that creation of style sheet, React has a special object called style sheet which has a method called create, which will be taking a list of objects with certain properties. As you can see here, we have binded the view with the style attribute and pointing to styles dot container, and that container says that okay, you have to keep the texts on center and justify the content on center and text the background color as an hexadecimal, and that's exactly how the React in iOS is now working, and that is the beauty of it. Now you can think this style as exactly the style sheet that we will be using in web development, right? In web development, what we'll be using is we'll be coming up with our view, which is nothing but written in HTML tags, and we will change the look and feel of the HTML tag by coming up with our own CSS by specifying whatever properties that is required for our specific look and feel, and that CSS in React Native world they call it as an style sheet. Exactly, it's a similar metaphor. Okay, but there are few more things that is present in the source file apart from these two components. Okay, I'll explain the remaining components. The first line is very simple. The first line says that okay, get me the React library in itself from require framework. Okay, and the second line says that uh, probably you might be thinking the second line is bit awkward syntax, right? Because in JavaScript you won't see a syntax something like this, right? The second line you can think of as an import statement that are available in other languages. React Native says that I have I am bundled up with lot of UI components like view, text, etc. But all those things won't be directly accessible to you until or unless you guys come and import me. So this line is nothing but an import statement. You can think this is very similar to Java's import statement or C or C++ include statement, right? So this is required. You have to specify all your dependencies here before itself you have to be using in any one of your components, correct? And that left out line in this source code is nothing but app registry dot register component, and which is having again a bit of weird syntax. I'll be explaining what this means, but before that let me open up the Xcode, which is opened up with first project, and let me go to the first project directory and click on appdelegate.m. This appdelegate.m is again created by React Native's init command. What this has is also a bit interesting. Okay, appdelegate.m has two sections. The first section is JS code location. The second section is React RCT root view. Okay, the first section JS code location says where the resulting application needs to run. Okay, and since we are deploying our code in an iOS simulator, we have specified a localhost address. Okay, if you want to put your code in a real device, then you have to change this into something else, which we'll be seeing up in later in our course. And the next section is bit important in binding an Objective-C code and as well as our JavaScript code. Okay, so sorry. So in this line, you can see it's creating an Objective-C object called root view. Out of other things, the one thing that is of important is it says okay, you have to import a module which we call it as an first project. Okay, and from where this module name is coming up, that's the answer of this line. In line number 57, you can see app registry dot register component. It registers a component with the name first project, and that's exactly is mapped over here. So let us confirm that is the case, let me go and stop the simulator. Let me go and change the first project to test it, the name. I'm copying that and pasting in the module name test it. Now let me run this. Oops. Yeah, see, you can see now the exact same result that was we are getting in our previous lectures. And the module name is important to understand, and the whole binding from JavaScript to the iOS native is happening at this line. And if you are very much interested in what RCT root view is, press command and click on this class and it will take you to its definition. Its definition says that RCT root view is nothing but a subclass of an UI view, which is the native UI view of iOS, right? Now, I hope you guys understood the resulting code that got generated from React Native in its command, and at the same time now you have understanding how to import specific React Native components into the JavaScript, and at the same time how to style our view components by using another React Native component which they call it as a style sheet. So in the next lecture I'm going to explain you how to debug the application in Chrome DevTools. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Welcome all to this lecture named Debugging React Native. In this lecture, I'm going to give a step-by-step introduction on how to debug your React Native application. As I've been explaining in my previous lectures, React Native is written completely in JavaScript. So debugging a React Native is nothing but debugging in JavaScript. Since we are in React Native world, React community have come up with their own tool which they call it as React Dev Tools. This dev tool is available for Chrome, Mozilla, and as well as Safari. So let me show you how to install that tool in your browser and how to get started with debugging your first React Native application. So let me go to browser, okay, and at the same time I've already started the simulator of our first project. The moment you refresh your simulator, you can see that a tab in my browser got opened to pointing to localhost 8081 slash debugger-ui. As this page says that this is the specific point for debugging your React Native application. Since my Chrome browser doesn't have React Native DevTools yet, I have to install it first. Click on the install button, which will take you to another page where they would say the steps for installation. Scroll down and you'll be seeing that there are links for downloading the specific React debugging tool extension for Chrome as well as for Mozilla. Since I'm using Chrome for this complete course, I'm going to click on Chrome Web Store in order to install the plugin to Chrome. Click on that particular link, which will be taking to your Chrome extension marketplace. And once you see the button add to Chrome, you can click on it and confirm it. It will take a couple of minutes or even a couple of seconds to get downloaded. It is just 234 KB in size. So once it's downloaded, you can actually start debugging your application. So it got downloaded and got added to your Chrome. Now go to the debugger URL, which is nothing but localhost 8080 slash debugger-ui. Refresh this. Now you can see that the notification page of installing React Native is gone. React debugging tool is gone. Now, what you have to do in order to get started with debugging is go to your simulator and refresh this project in your simulator. Now, the moment you refresh the project, you can see the status as debugger session and unique ID, and it's saying it is active. Now, open developer console and click on sources tab, and you can see here now that your JavaScript file, which is mounted and running in your iOS simulator, is being mapped in your Chrome Dev tool. Now you have all liberty to set breakpoints on whatever lines you want and start debugging. For example, let me attach a breakpoint to the line number 54, which says app_registry.register component. Once I have attached the debugger on my Chrome Dev Tools, you have to go to your simulator and press Command R for refreshing your project. Now you can see that the simulator get stopped because I have already set it up the breakpoint here. So you can now have a full control of stepping over into this register component function and see how React Native it's working behind the scenes. The main reason I have introduced to this tool is you can debug React Native very easily, because many of the people will be knowing of setting or debugging JavaScript in beforehand. So debugging an React Native application is equivalent to debugging a JavaScript application. So this is the end of the lecture. I hope you guys understand how to debug it. So until or unless you remove or the breakpoint in your debugger, your IO is not going to respond. So probably I can click on that, and now you can see the resulting screen as expected. So this is the end of this lecture. We'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you guys. Hello all, welcome to this lecture named What We Are Going to Build. In this lecture, I'm going to say what the end product of this complete section will be. We are going to build a very simple weather application that, given a user input of pin code, the country's pin code or state's pin code, it's going to find the weather of that particular pin code. Okay, if you feel that this application is very minimal, I agree that this is very minimal for starting React Native. But as the section progress on, in the next upcoming sections, I'm going to take this fundamental weather API and completely change them into a GPS enabled application which uses React Native's GPS systems to get automatically the current location of the user and find the or predict the weather for the upcoming weeks. But for now, in this section, we are going to build a very minimal application which has a simple input text box which will take a user input. For example, let me giving me the input of our state and press enter. Oh, sorry, it was wrong input. And it comes and gives the current status of the state, right? And that's it about the application that we are going to build in this particular section. But however, as I was mentioning, the application sounds very small and simple. These are the things that we'll be covering in this particular section while building the complete application. So the first thing we'll see is how to create different components in React. Second thing is we'll see how those different components will communicate with each other, and we'll introduce the most important point of React Native, which they call it as property and state. We'll see the differences between them, when to use which one, and what has advantages over another. Okay, and the last part that we'll be learning in this particular section is how to use React Native's networking API calls in order to hit the third-party REST APIs. Because this example, on the moment I press enter after entering the pin code of a particular area, it's going to give a networking API from React Native to the web, get the request and response, and just passes the response according to our application strategy. Okay, so these are the things that we are going to learn in this particular section. We'll start with very minimal, as I was mentioning before in this lecture, but as the course is towards the end, we'll be in a very good position of building an application which works in by itself. That's what I was mentioning earlier. The application will be automatically picking your location from GPS and displaying the current weather location. But for this section, this is the idea of I have. So that's it with this particular lecture. The upcoming lectures will get you started by writing the required code for this complete application, and the next lecture I'll explain how to get the code samples from my GitHub repository and how we can be in a position for syncing our code and make sure that everything working fine at end of each lectures. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to this lecture named How to Get the Code. In this lecture, I'm going to explain from where you need to get the working code for our sample project, which we termed it as weather application. So all the code examples that I'm going to cover in this particular course is all put up in my GitHub profile. So uh, the weather application project is being hoisted in GitHub in a separate repository whose URL you can see it here. Anyways, I'm going to paste the same URL in the lectures resources directory so you can grab from there. So you can directly go and clone the project, which I'll be updating upcoming days. So you can open your terminal in Mac and go to any of the directories in which you have to clone the project. It might be desktop or downloads or whatever you like. From there you have to run git clone and paste the URL, which will be cloning the project from my GitHub repository to your local machine. Once that is done, you can navigate to the project. You can see that all the files from my GitHub repository has been cloned successfully in your machine. So the idea of building the weather app is bit incremental model. So I have created a lot of branches, and each branch in my Git will represent a milestone that will be covering in the lectures. What I mean by that is, let me run git ls-remote, which is going to print all the branches that is available in my repository. As you can see, there are a lot of branches. For example, the Ajax branch has a specific code that will be developing for our weather application to use React Native's network API calls to hit HTTP request and get HTTP response. Similarly, I have other branches which you guys need to change when you see the particular lecture so that we all stay in same place. For example, text input handler is a branch where the milestone of our weather application will be having a text box along with its handler. So that is the whole idea. Each branch is been pointing to each of its milestone. Do not worry if those milestone or these branch names make sense to you now. I'm going to explain each of the branches in each lecture and how you have to correlate it with it. Okay, but this is the idea. Every source code or every assets that I'm going to use in my project is put up in this particular URL. You can feel free to go check it out, and if you find any issues you can give a pull request so that all the students that taking my course will collaborate with each other to build a very cool weather application. And that is the whole idea of it. Starting from the next lecture, we'll be getting our hands dirty by starting using React Native APIs. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the lecture named How to Get Input from User. So in this lecture, we'll start creating our first initial project which we'll be using for building the weather application. So the first step to do that is use React Native command and pass init argument and pass the project name. I'll call it as weather project 2 and click on enter. It says already exists. Probably I'm go and remove it and let me rerun it. So what we are going to see in this particular lecture is I'm going to explain you what all necessary steps involved in presenting the text input field in an iOS application. This text input field will allow the user to enter any sort of text. Considering this with our weather application, this will allow the user to provide their pin code, which we'll be using in future to grab the weather condition for them and display it. So it, the first lecture of this will be going to see how exactly we are going to build only the text input element. So let's wait for the project to be set it up. It will take a couple of minutes. It's spinning. So I request you guys to do the same thing along with me. So whenever I'm starting a lecture and whenever I'm creating a new project or new project directory structure, I request you guys to follow on the same steps so that you guys don't uh, get stuck somewhere, because start everything in the clean state. It will help us to progress very fast and at a very rapid speed. It's almost done. It's just the final step in creating the project, and it's done. So good. So let us open up the created directory. Let me go and open that in Xcode, and at the same time let me go and open up the JS file in Sublime Text Edit. Okay, so what we'll do in this lecture is I'm going to completely write the JavaScript code that is required for showing the text input to the user. So what I'll do is I'll go and comment the complete project file and start from the beginning. Okay, so the first step in creating any React Native application is to get React Native's handle. How to do that in JavaScript? If you're very familiar with web development, it is very straightforward. You have to get the React Native object from the require library. If you're not, and this is the syntax for it, var of React is equal to require of React Native. This specific line gets the React Native bundle, the required JavaScript object, from the require library and assign it to our handler, which we term it as React. Once we got that, we need to proceed with the next step, which is nothing but importing the necessary UI elements and importing necessary objects which we'll be using in this particular JavaScript file. In order to do that, we have to follow a syntax that has been given by the React community. So you can consider this as import in other languages as well. How in Java, in order to use another class files, you have to import it in the respective classes, right? Similarly, in React Native world, you have to import the necessary UI components before even you have to use it in your project. So we'll be using a view component. So let me import that. A text component, let me import that as well. And we'll be using style sheet component. Okay, for now these three is more than enough, and let's proceed. And I'll create the first component using React Native libraries. How to do that? It's very simple. As you have seen in previous lecture, I'm going to call React. React now is nothing but pointing to the React Native's library, and call a method called create class. This create class will create a component and assign it back to weather project 2. This component is very specific to React Native world, which will be having special methods like render, as we have seen in the previous lecture, and other similar methods which are very specific to React Native world, like get initial state. Other methods I'll be explaining in the upcoming lectures, but for now we know that whenever a component is being rendered by React Native, the first method of the component that will be getting called is render. So let us go and define the render method. And let us return a particular view inside the render method. View slash view. This line from 15 to 22 says that create a React component, and which will be owning a method called render, which when called will return an empty view. In order to test our program is running perfectly fine, let us go and start in Xcode. But before that, we need to expose our weather project to module so that our Xcode can pick it up. As I was explained in the previous section, you have to register your module in your JavaScript file. So how we do that? There is an object called app registry, which has a method called register component, which will take the module name, which I'm going to keep the same name as weather project 2, and take an anonymous function, which is nothing but this one. So this one is very specific to ES6 syntax. If you worried about this one, you can simply ignore that. It just returns weather project 2, which is nothing but this object, right? And do not forget to import app registry as well, because that is also required, because React Native doesn't import anything for you. You have to do everything on behalf of ourselves. So now let me go to Xcode. Let me click on run button. It will take some time to build and compile it. As you can see, React package manager got started. Xcode is still analyzing and building our project. That's good. So package manager seems to be ready. And it's going to be launching in a couple of seconds. Okay, it's compiling the asserts. Yep, done. So as you now know that we are not putting up anything on the view, but rather than just the view object. So you won't be seeing anything apart from a blank screen. But however, there is an error. Let me go and see what that error means. Okay. So you have to import these components into our React. Okay, so I've forgotten that equal to React, and that's what React is actually complaining about. Now let me go to the iOS simulator. Since we are running React Native, you can easily press Command R to refresh the project. Now we got the expected result, an empty view which doesn't have anything. The reason because we are calling only the view component but not providing any child elements. Now let us go and do that. Let me add in one more text. The text will be nothing but enter your pin code, save it, and go in Command R. Oops, now the text code is appearing, but it's been appearing in the top left corner of your application. That looks very bad, but we'll go and fix that up. As you are aware in web development how an HTML element will be styled using CSS, the same logic applies in React Native also. An element from React Native can be styled using another component which React Native provides by default, which they call it as a style sheet. Let me go and create that component as well. So style sheet is a component that I've already imported again. So style sheet dot create, you have to call in order to create a style sheet component. This create takes in a JSON structure, so you can specify as many styles that you want in your project by separating with commas. For now, let me go and create only one style, which is nothing but container, and that container takes a list of key value pair. Probably what I'll do is I'll align all the items center in this specific container, and also justify the content to and center. Okay, now let me go and refresh this, and you see nothing got happened. The reason because I've created the style sheet, but I didn't bind that with the view. Again, this sounds very similar to how you will be binding your CSS to the HTML elements, right? So how will we be binding? Similar to DOM, the answer is you have to use another attribute of the React Native components, which they call it as style. You have to pass on the style, what style is required. So in this case, I'm going to refer styles. Styles is nothing but the variables that we got defined here. Styles dot container. Save it. Go to the simulator. Now refresh it. Now it got over here, but it doesn't came here. The reason because is we have to add in one more element to our style sheet, which is nothing but flex. I'll explain what flex is in a moment. Now after refresh, you can see your component of text is appearing in the center. Flex is nothing but an layout mechanism that React Native supports by default. Now this flex of 1, what it says is any element, for example in this case enter your pin code, flex of 1 makes sure that it occupies completely on any particular coordinate x and y. What I mean by that is, imagine any one of your app user is going to change your orientation of the phone from landscape to portrait. What will happen? Let me demonstrate that in the iOS simulator. Press command left or shift keys, which will change your view. Now you can notice that enter your pin code is still in the proper position. So flex does this thing. Flex makes sure that this doesn't get bad when your app users or changing the orientation of your phone. So that is the whole idea of the flex one. I'll be explaining flex in the upcoming lectures, but for now you can think that as a layout rendering mechanism that is very specifically available to React Native world. Now we have our text in place. Now the next task is to go and add text input. So let me go and add text input. Make sure that you have to import that component before even you are using it. So let me go and do that. Now I've added it. Refresh your iOS simulator, nothing comes. The reason because I've asked the React Native to render text input but haven't given any styles or how much size or how much height of the text input should be visible. In order to do that, I can create one more style sheet in my container, but what I'll do is I'll do inline styling. Inline styling is very similar to again the HTML DOM inline styling elements, but in React the syntax is a bit different. If you're doing inline styling in React, you have to do with double curly braces. Unlike if you're referring to any of your style sheet, it is just one curly braces. So now let me go and give the style. So let me go and give the height as 40 and the border color might be gray and border width to be 3. Save it and go and refresh it. Wow, you got it as expected. But as you can see here, it's touching the corners, which we do not want to happen. So what we'll do is we'll put up the margin. So margin of say 10. Now it's been moved. Margin of 10, what it does is it just moves from all direction 10 pixels. So finally we'll add a placeholder for our text input area so that it gives hint to the user what need to be entered in our text input. So in order to do that, text input from React Native supports an attribute called placeholder, which takes a string. Inside the string, I'm going to write it as zip code. Now open up your simulator, press Command plus R. Now we could see that the zip code got generated in the exact location where we wanted. And that's the end of this first lecture. And actually we have completed our task of creating a text input which will allow the user to enter anything. So you can test it. You can use your Mac keyboard to type something into the text field. If you want to open up the mobile specific keyboard, what you have to do is you have to click on hardware, click on keyboard, uncheck the connect hardware keyboard and click on this guy. Now you cannot type with your Mac machine's keyboard, but you can type only with the iOS simulator keyboard. Right, so that's it with this lecture. What I'll be covering in the next lecture is something interesting. Until then, I see you guys. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the lecture named Get Initial State What It Is. In this lecture, I'm going to explain few of the lifecycle methods that is happening in React Native. So first we'll understand what an lifecycle method is. As we know, React Native calls the render method in its own way, meaning whenever it feels that it needs to be called. Even rendered method is one of the React's lifecycle method. Similar to render, there are a lot of React's lifecycle method, and each method has its own value or own properties which can be carried throughout the React Native's lifecycle. So one such method is very important to understand because we'll be using in this current project, and that method is called as get initial state. Let me open up React's documentation. Okay, the React documentation says that get initial state method will be called before the component is mounted. If you are not getting what they meant by mounted, is nothing but before even your render method is called. Okay, and they say that the return value will be used as the initial value of this dot state. I'll explain what does this mean in a moment. Let me go back to the code. Let me go and create the get initial state method. Get initial state function, and let me return an object of it. Okay, so I'm returning an empty object. So you can open up your iOS simulator and refresh the project. Nothing breaks. Okay, the reason because get initial state, the React Native knows that it is one of the lifecycle method that it will be called. As specified in the document, it will be called even before the render method is invoked. So the trick here is you can think of get initial state as a constructor for the React component. When I mean by constructor, you can think as Java's constructor or C or C++ constructor, which will be called before creating an object in Java, right? Similarly, before even the render method is getting called, get initial state function will be executed, and whatever you return from that function will be carried throughout the React Native's component lifecycle. What I mean by that is till whether project 2 is being maintained by React Native, the get initial state object will be lived in it. Okay, so let us go and make use of it. Let me go and create a property called margin with value as 10. You can of course create whatever value you want, probably something like this, because it's nothing but a plain JavaScript object. Now what I'll do is, instead of referring margin as 10 numerically, I'll refer the state of my React Native component, which I have already defined over here by accessing it. How I'll access it? As already mentioned in the document, using this dot state. So this dot state gives the object that is getting returned from get initial state function. As we now know that that object has two properties, margin and value, you can now access margin with something like this. Save it and go and refresh your simulator. You'll be seeing the same exact behavior because we have not changed or not broken anything. But in order to see that actually the state's margin is getting passed to the text inputs margin, let us go and increase the size of the margin from 10 to 20. Save your file and go to your iOS simulator and refresh it. Now you could see that a bit of size is being moved, which means that get initial state is working as specified in the documentation. The reason I am introducing you to the get initial state is because we'll be using this in this particular project, and I'll explain how we'll be using this particular lifecycle method. And that's it with this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to explain how to run this milestone of getting your text input in an iOS simulator from the Github repository that I've already shared with you. Until then, see you guys. Welcome all to the lecture named Executing the Code from GitHub. In this lecture, I'm going to explain how to clone the GitHub repository from my account and see the examples from your local machine. So let me start with this lecture. So as I was explaining in my previous lecture, all the code samples that I have defined in this particular sections are put up in my GitHub profile. The URL is over here. As already said, I'll be specifying this URL in the lectures resources directory. So grab that from there. So you have to copy the GitHub's URL, go to your terminal, go to the location that you want your code to be and run this command git clone, enter. This will clone my GitHub project into your local machine. Once that is done, you have to navigate into the project directory and you will be seeing the React Native's iOS project. So the first step is run the command git space ls remote. This command will list out all the branches that is available in the remote repository. What I mean by remote repository is nothing but the repository that I am owning at this URL. Okay, so as you can see, there are a lot of branches. One of the branches that I'm going to show right now is text input. This branch of code will be having the complete source code that we built in the previous lecture. The idea of having separate branches in my GitHub project is to separate out each lecture's end product as the source code. So you have to go and grab that particular branch. So we have to run git space checkout space text input. Okay, so now you can cross check that you are in branch text input by running the command git space branch. Once that is done, you have to run npm space install. This npm space install will install all the necessary libraries that are specified in my package.jsn. Note that I am being pushed only the required JavaScript file for iOS and as well as the required directory structure for our Xcode project. But none of my GitHub samples will be owning the node modules where all the React Native dependencies will reside. In order to download those node modules, I've specified everything in the package.jsn by which you have to get everything from. So you have to run npm install, which will parse this package.jsn and get all the necessary dependencies in behalf of you and store them in the necessary directories. So it takes a couple of minutes to get it complete. Once that is done, you can see it prints a successful message. It's almost done. It's running the final step of npm install, which is in this case node post install. So let us wait for a couple of more seconds. I guess it's done. This running still and it's done. Once that is npm install command have done its execution, you have to open the directory where you have cloned my GitHub project and open into the iOS directory and open weather project.xcode project, which will be opening up the Xcode. So once the Xcode has been loaded, you can go and directly click on the run command, which will start the React package manager, which will be starting the React node server, and you can see that Xcode is building and compiling our product. Now it will be launching the iOS simulator where you can see the resulting product that we built in our previous lecture. So let us give some time. The package is ready and it's serving the files. And it's transforming all your JS files into the native iOS calls, and there you go. You can see the exact same functional behavior of our application that we built in the previous lecture is available completely in the git branch name text input. So this is the idea. I'll be walk through all the code that is necessary in each lectures. At the same time, we'll be building and pushing those codes into GitHub repository so that in case by any chance if you got stuck with your development environment, the only place you have to go and look for help is this repository, and you have to then move to a particular branch that you're looking for and then run npm space install, and everything will be working as expected. In the next lecture we'll be continuing our building our weather app project. So in the next lecture I'll be explaining you what is an idea of building a separate altogether component. Until then, see you guys. Welcome all to the lecture named Building New Component. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss the design process involved in designing or creating a new React component, and at the same time how to combine two components and mount it to a single component. So let's get started. The source code from where I'll begin this task is under my GitHub project's branch name text input. If you're not aware of how to get my GitHub project repository and set it in your machine, I request you guys to kindly go to my previous lecture in which I have given the incomplete detail of walkthrough what is required in order to get my GitHub repository projects. So let's get started. So we'll think or talk about our design perspective of our application. We already have an weather project which in React Native term they call it as a component. Now imagine that we need to display the current weather status in a separate component, okay, which we have it to be creating. Now let me open up the simulator and show you what is the current state of our application is. The current state of our application is nothing but having a text which says enter your zip code and having a text input which allows the user to enter the necessary zip code of their state or country. Now what we come to the conclusion is we will build a separate component which will be displaying the current weather details of the given pin code somewhere down the line over here. In order to do that, I'm going to separate the concern of displaying the weather details from weather project component to a separate component which we term it as forecast component. So let us go and create that new component which we call forecast component. Let me go and create the forecast component. And since I'm saying about React component, we have to again use the same React method create class in order to create our new component. And similarly, we have to write the render method which will be taking a function and returning the view part of our particular component. In this case, it's nothing but forecast. Let me write the return statement. And let me save it. Now, in order to visually show that forecast component is being rendered on my iOS simulator, let me go and add a dummy text field which we know already how to create it using the text component that is coming from the React Native's element. So let us say that this is an forecast component. Now we have the forecast component ready with render method which is going to render some dummy data. Now we have to embed this forecast component in our weather project. How to do that? That is very simple. You have to first define the component in terms of JSX syntax. So what you have to follow is you have to open the angle bracket and say your component name. In this case, it's nothing but forecast, and simply close it. Now this forecast is a reference to a UI component which is nothing but this guy, And remember that I've already specified in my previous lecture, all your JSX syntax should be in your render method. So the place where it should go over here is render method. Now I've defined the forecast. Now you can refer this forecast object in your return call stack by using the curly brace syntax which React Native have defined. Now I have saved the file. Now you can go to your iOS simulator and press Command plus R in order to see that our forecast component now is being rendered along with the weather project component. Now this comes to an end of our lecture. We have explained how to create a separate component, at the same time how to mount that component with another component. In the next lecture, I'll be discussing how to make the communication between the two components in React Native. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the lecture named How to Pass Data Between Two React Components. In this lecture, I'm going to explain what technique you have to follow in order to pass data between any two given components in React Native world. So let me open up the iOS simulator of our current project, which is in the state like this. So let me walk through what we have built till now. We have defined a weather project which owns two view components, which is nothing but this text component and as well as an text input component. And this text input component is where the user will be entering the pin code to get their current weather location. And we have come up with a separate altogether component which we term it as forecast, which is responsible for displaying the resulting weather condition data in its own view. Now given this two components, there comes a logical question. Now imagine about our end product. The user will be entering a pin code, whatever it may be, and user will be pressing the return key, which will be firing a network request and gets back the data. Now think logically that this view is nothing but the text input, and this text input is completely belongs to this component. So imagine at end of our product, we are going to assign an event listener to this text input, which will be getting fired when the user press the return key, and that's the operation of getting the current weather condition of the given pin code. And all that operations is going to be happening in our component, which we call it as weather project. But remember that once we get the data from our network calls of the given pin code's current location, we need to pass on that data to a different component. In this case, it's nothing but the forecast component, which is going to display the result in the iOS simulator view. Now, the question is how we are going to achieve this. And the answer for that question is use props. Props is a technology, or it's a pattern that is used in React Native world to pass data between two components. Now you can think that for any given component X and Y in React Native, the only way they can be communicated is nothing but using props. So I understanding that you guys got the idea behind props, because props is very important to understand, which will make the communication between different components easier and also more quicker to understand. And I hope you guys have clear understanding on what props means. And in the next lecture, I'm going to showcase the real code that is required in order to pass the data from weather project to the another component. In this case, it's nothing but forecast. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Welcome on to this lecture named React versus React Native. In this lecture, I'm going to give the key differentiate between React framework and as well as React Native framework. At the same time, I'm going to introduce a new concept called JSX, which is going to be the same for React and as well as React Native. So let's get started. So React is a framework that has been designed and developed by keeping web developers in mind. Using React, you can develop web application. So you can put React is for web application, whereas React Native, as I was explaining in my previous lecture, it's for mobile application. Okay, so React is supported by JavaScript and JSX. Obviously, in order to design any web-based application, you should be using JavaScript for sure. But Facebook guys have come up with a new terminology called JSX, which I'll be explaining in some moment. So React Native is also going to be the same technology stack. React Native can be written using JavaScript and as well as using JSX. So I'll explain what is JSX is. So JSX is an expression language that allows developers to write HTML fragment code into their JavaScript file. If you have any prior knowledge on web development, you can very well see that a JavaScript file cannot have a HTML syntax or HTML code, right? Typically, all HTML code will be wrapped up in a separate file with an extension .html and JavaScript file with an extension .js. To make that point clear, let me open up inspect element, okay, which might open up the console for me. Yes. So in the console, I can type any JavaScript, something like var of a is equal to creating an object, right? So this is a valid JavaScript, but I cannot type HTML/HTML. It's going to throw me an exception saying that, this is not a valid syntax of JavaScript, right? Because this is a valid syntax of HTML. Since console is going to execute all your snippets in JavaScript engine, this is not at all a valid syntax according to the JavaScript engine. So the idea is using JSX, you can mix both as well as, meaning both your HTML and as well as JavaScript. So that's what your .js file now will be containing both HTML code as well as JavaScript code. Okay, so a very simple example of that terminology is shown here in the small code snippet. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to mix up both your HTML code and as well as JavaScript code, your file extension should be .jsx, not .js. Okay, as you can see in this code, this guy is a valid HTML, right? And whereas this guy is right, like document.getElementById is a valid JavaScript call. As you can see, now both HTML and as well as JavaScript code is combined and they call it as .jsx. Now how React or even React Native works is the .jsx file will be given to React, and then React parses this file and sees that, okay, I am seeing something which the developer have given it as an HTML tag. I'm going to create a HTML tag for him. Note that clearly, now React is creating the DOM for us by inspecting your or parsing your .jsx code. Whereas in other web development mode, you'll be creating your DOM elements, which is nothing but your HTML elements, in a separate file called .html, which when opened by the browser is obviously will be rendered by the browser. Whereas in React, the case is a bit different. React is going to parse your .jsx and going to create the DOM in behalf of for you. Okay, by the same way of create and maintaining the DOM that is taken care by the React has a separate concept called virtual DOM. Okay, so all your .jsx will be parsed and React will be first pushing the DOM structure that you have given in your .jsx to what it is called as virtual DOM. From virtual DOM, it's going to push into the real DOM, which the browser can understand. Okay, so we need to understand what is virtual DOM in order to proceed further with React Native in depth. Okay, so we'll see what is virtual DOM in the next lecture. Thank you. Welcome all to the lecture What is props and its usage. As discussed in the previous lecture, I given an overview of what an props is and how it will be used to enable the data communication between two given components in React Native. In this lecture, I'm going to continue that discussion and show you the code level walkthrough of how to use props in your React Native project and how to enable or pass data between the two React Native components. So let's get started. Uh, I'm currently in the source code of index.ios.js, and the application that is running in the iOS simulator looks like this. This is the exact state that I have passed upon in my previous lecture. So let's get started. Passing props is very simple. Okay, you can define the props on the fly as necessary. What I mean by that is, here is the forecast component in JSX syntax, and I'm saying take an attribute called learn props whose value is, hey, it works. Save it and refresh your iOS simulator. Nothing happens. But technically, this is what React Native calls as a property or attribute. Okay. Now, this learn property, when the forecast component is being built up, this learn property is sent as an property to this forecast component, so that inside the forecast component you can access this property. How to access that property inside your forecast component? React Native says that you have to use this dot props dot the property name. In this case, it's nothing but learn prop. Now, if you save this file and go to your iOS simulator and refresh it, you can see that our property from and weather project component is passed to the forecast component, and it works as expected. And this is the very fundamental example of how to use props. Again, I'll repeat the concept behind props. This learn attribute that you are defining in the forecast line will be converted into a property, and React Native by itself passes this as a property to the components property, which React Native called as this.props. So you can access this.props, the property name. And one more good thing is you can pass many properties as required. So probably you can pass props of 2 is equal to next value. And again, the same way you can access it by using this dot props of 2. Save your file, go to your iOS simulator and refresh it. Now you can see that the next property is also being passed from weather project to the another component called forecast. Now, given the very sample example of how to create and pass the properties in React Native, let us go and make it a much more concrete example. What I'll do is I'll remove the properties and I'll go and create 3 text views for our project. So one is already being there. I'm going to create the others. Text slash text. This one I'm going to say as forecast details, and the second one is current weather, and the third one is nothing but the Fahrenheit that will be displaying in our end project. Now go to your iOS simulator, refresh it, you could see the dummy text that we have used it here. Now we'll make use of passing the properties and bind certain values to our forecast component from our weather project component. In order to do that, I'm going to create yet another object in my get initial state, and I call that object as forecast, and that object is going to take few key value properties. Out of them are main, which is going to be main. I'm giving for now it's dummy value, and this next one is description, again it's dummy, and the last one is temp, which I'm going to give as 36. Now, as I've already explained in my previous lecture, getInitialState method will be called before even the render function is getting called, which means that I can access the getInitialState's returned object in my render method using this dot state property, as I've already mentioned in my previous lecture. You can see the example right now over here. So I'll be using the same strategy here to pass for now the dummy values to forecast as an property. Let's go and do it. I call it as main is equal to, I'm going to refer the current state of my weather project component, so that I'm opening and open and close curly braces, and I'm saying this dot state dot forecast dot main. Let me check everything works fine, and everything was working fine without any errors or issues. Now, in order to get the data that is getting passed from weather project component to the exact forecast component, as I was explaining in the couple of minutes ago, you have to use this dot props dot the value of the key of the props. And now you can go and refresh your iOS simulator. You will be seeing the dummy value, which is nothing but the main. Now let us go and do the same for other text fields as well. This dot props dot description, and temperature will put it before our Fahrenheit symbol. This dot props dot temperature. Now we need to pass the necessary stuffs here. Description is equal to this dot state dot forecast dot description, and temp is equal to this dot state dot forecast dot temp. Let me make it a bit more readable. Perfect. Save your file, go to your iOS simulator and refresh, and you can see that our state object is now being passed as a property to another component. In this case, it's forecast. And that brings us to the end of the lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to explain the differences that is involved in the key concept behind properties, which is nothing but this dot props, and the state, which is nothing but this dot state. So I hope you have enjoyed and understood this lecture. See you in the next lecture. Thank you. Welcome all to the lecture named Props versus State. In the previous lecture, I was shown an example of passing the props between two components. In this lecture, I'm going to explain the difference between state and the props, because this is very key thing to understand in React Native world. Before I'm going to explain the differences, let me go and explain what an state of an component is. As I was explained previously in my lecture, a state of a component can be returned from a special React Native lifecycle method, which React Native calls it as getInitialState. Whatever object that you're returning becomes the initial state of your complete component. You can think this as an constructor in other languages like Java. This method will be getting called first before even your component is being mounted, which means that getInitialState function will be called first before your render function is actually called and the exact view is being ported to your iOS simulator. So whatever you feel an component should be owning, the data should reside in getInitialState function, and that is the whole idea of state in React Native. Whereas props is nothing but a way to communicate between two components. Now let me give you an explanation from our design perspective so that you will have a better understanding on the differences between state and a property. Let me open up our iOS simulator application that we have built till date. Let me refresh it. Our application is very simple. As starting from this section lectures, we have went through several design thinking, and there was some point we thought that we will come and create a new component called forecast, which is only responsible for showing the forecast details, right? And that will be used by the weather project. But note that the forecast details that this forecast component is displaying is coming from the weather project's forecast state object. As you can see here, I am passing main as one of the properties of forecast from the current state of the weather project. The reason because is that the data of the forecast is completely binded to weather project component, and you can now say that both props and state are completely related. Now let me explain that again in a different terminology. Now let me open up the iOS simulator, and you can see that we have a text input in which the user will be entering their countries or state pin code. Let me enter some pin code, and when the user presses enter, there going to be happen a network call which will request a third-party API to get the current weather location of the given pin code, and it comes back to the weather project because the text input component is hosted on the weather project component, and we will update this forecast object as necessary that is coming from the response. So for example, imagine that I'm going to give the pin code of London and hit return key, and I'm getting the response from the third party API as 37° Fahrenheit temperature in London, which is going to be updated in this forecast object, right? And similarly, if I'm going to change for other states, the same is going to repeat in an event loop. Now, what React says that is, whenever your initial state object get changed, I will be calling your render method. Now, haven't given this documentation from React Native, let us think from the technical perspective how it will work. Now let me go back again to your iOS simulator, and again I'm going to share the same example. I'm going to give some random pin code. I'm going to hit enter, right? It is going to trigger a network call. It's going to get back the result, and it's going to update in the forecast object. Obviously for now we don't have the code as of now to update it, but eventually we'll build it. So the moment it's got updated, what we expect as a user, obviously we need to re-render this page, which means that we need to call this render function, which in turn calls or pass the current state of our weather project as props to another component which we call as forecast, which is going to update or re-render the details of the given pin code. And that is the whole idea of props and state. Now I hope you guys understood that both props and state are completely related to each other, and another way of thinking that as each component can own another component in terms of React Native world. In our case, weather project component is owning the forecast component. Agreed? Now you can say and state of a component can become the props of its child component. Now in this case, our weather component is the parent component which is hosting the child, which means that this weather project's object from get initial state function can, or it is valid to become the property of its child component, which in this case is nothing but forecast. And this is the design pattern or design thinking that React Native community follows strictly in their development life cycle. And that comes us to our end of our lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to explain how to bind event handler to the text input. I hope you have understood the difference between props and state, and you can replay the complete lecture if you got stuck, or if you feel it's a lot of things to grab it. You can anyways start a discussion, which I'm always there to help out you guys. So until the next lecture, it's bye from me, Anto. Thank you. Welcome all to this lecture, adding event handler to text input. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to add an event handler to our text area, which in turn will be called by React Native. So let's get started. Before we get started, this is the state of my application as before where we have left in our previous lecture. So nothing I've added in between. So we can now proceed and add our event handler to the UI component text input. So it's very simple to do that. React Native provides an default attribute, they call it as on submit editing, which takes the necessary function which will be getting called on the event on enter. Okay, so let us go and bind some function for this event handler. Probably we'll call it as handle input text, save it, and now let us go and create this brand new function over here. For now, this function doesn't do anything apart from printing some welcome message, probably hello world, in order to test that actually our event binding to our text input area is working as expected. So let me go and open iOS simulator. Let me refresh it. Let me type some pin code and press return key. Now you can open your Xcode and see that there is our hello world message that is getting printed, which means that our event handler on click of enter key is working as expected. Okay, as you can see, there are a lot of logs that it's getting printed, and that's what we need to build in this particular lecture. Now, given the fact that we have binded an event handler to text input, the next lecture will make use of React Native's network APIs in order to get the current weather location of the given input. In the next lecture, I'll show you how to do that. Before we close this lecture, one more key point that you have to observe in this particular lecture is I have started the method name handle input text with an underscore. In React's world, this means that this method where it is being defined, in this case it got defined in our weather project component, is called as private method to our only weather project component. So whenever you are reading an book on React Native and if you see that a method is started with an underscore, which means that the author's intention is to make sure that the reader understand that that particular method is private to its enclosing component. In our case, underscore handle input text is very much private to our weather project component. And that's it with this lecture. In the next lecture, we will see how to use React Native's network API calls. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to this lecture named Use ES6 to Simplify the Code. In this lecture, I'm going to explain you what is ES6 is all about and how we'll be getting benefit out of ES6. ES6 is a new standard for the next version of JavaScript. By the introduction of ES6, a lot of dramatic change in JavaScript have been given to the community. There are a lot of changes in ES6 spec, but we'll be seeing only few out of them, which is going to give us a bit of benefit in our current situation. The ES6 spec have introduced a new concept called lambda expression, and lambda expression is a new way of writing a function definition. Okay, let me show you a quick example of how to write a lambda expression in our current project. I have the code of index.ios.js that we have been building till in our previous lecture, and I'm looking at the current method handle input text where we have been using the fetch network API from React Native in order to make React Native network calls. Now I'm going to change the body of the then function to a lambda expression. And lambda expression is nothing but, as I was mentioning, a syntactic sugar over a new function definition. So this is my lambda expression. All right, if you feel that this is a bit of not innovative to you, you have to adjust with it. The reason is because this lambda expression is the next version of declaring a function in JavaScript 6. Of course, in ES6 also the old way of declaring function is still acceptable, but I request you guys to stay with this design process in our current course. The reason for that I'll explain you in the next couple of lecture, because this lambda expression has a very good advantage of using it. That advantage I'll explain in the next couple of lecture. So I've rewritten our previous function declaration into what we call it as ES6 lambda expression. So I'm going to save this file. Let me open up our iOS simulator, refresh it. Let me open up the Xcode, delete all the logs and run something and press enter. You should be able to see the same behavior of our response getting printed in the Xcode. And that's exactly happening in this situation, which means that our behavior of our application doesn't got changed, but only the way in which we declare our function in JavaScript is got changed. So by default, React Native supports ES6 syntax, and it makes sure that it converts your lambda expression into a proper function declaration. All right, and that's exactly what I want to give to you guys. The next lecture I'm going to cover set state, which is another React Native lifecycle method. We will see in next lecture what that specific method is up to and how to use it in our project. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Welcome all to this lecture named Making Network Calls. In this lecture, I'm going to show you the code example of how to use React Native's network API in order to make an HTTP request and at the same time how to get back its response. So I'll be starting with the previous state where I have stopped my coding session. As you can see, the application that is currently running in the iOS simulator doesn't do anything apart from where we have left in our previous lecture. In our previous lecture, we have binded an event handler to text input which just prints hello world. So let us quickly check that is happening in our simulator. I'm pressing enter on it and open your Xcode, and you can see that hello world is getting printed, and that is exactly what we want. Now before I go and explain you the network API calls, we need to get the text that is being entered by the user in our text input so that we can pass the zip code to another third-party API. In order to get the text that is being typed in the input, you have to use the implicit property in React Native, which they call it as an event. So let me go and change the necessary steps. In order to get the event, you have to name a parameter by whatever you want to be, but I'll keep it as simple as event here. And this event has a lot of properties, out of which we are interested in its text property, which is nothing but the user entered value in the text input area. So let me go and quickly confirm that. Zip is equal to event dot native event dot text, and instead of printing hello world, let me print that zip, and I'm saved that file. Let me open up the iOS simulator, refresh the project, and at the same time go to Xcode, clear all your previous logs. Now go to your iOS simulator, type something, for example, some random number, and press enter. The moment you press enter, our handle input text function is getting called, and as we have taken the event property and inspecting its text key, Xcode is printing exactly the key that is being entered by the user. Now, given that fact, now we have the user entered value. Now we'll move on to see how to use that in our network API calls. Let me go back to the Sublime edit. Let me remove this console.log guy. React Native by default provides a method called fetch, which is used to make networking calls inside our React Native project. And that is very simple to use. Let me go and show that in a moment. So I'm writing fetch takes an single argument, which is nothing but the URL that you want to hit to. We'll be using the Open Weather API URL, which I have copy pasted from its documentation, and I'm pasting it over here. And this is our third party API, which allows us to query the current weather location given an pin code. Now I'm passing Q, which is nothing but the pin code that we are getting from the user. And as you have known that pin code is now stored in a variable called zip. Let me type zip, and at the same time I'm going to pass yet another parameter which it called as unit, which I'll pass the value as imperial, which means that I'm asking the imperial value of the current weather. Now this is done. Okay, now you can go and refresh your iOS simulator and start typing something and press enter. Nothing gets printed. The reason because is we have given the network API and request to our Open Weather URL, but we are not listening or capturing its response. In order to capture its response, fetch provides a method called then, which will be called once the particular URL is done with its request process. And that then method will be called with a function, a single parameter function, nothing but the response from our request, which we can use it for further tasks. So let me go and print that in our console, and let me refresh that in my iOS simulator, and let me go back to Xcode, delete the log file, and let me type something and press enter. Now you can see that we got a bunch of response from our Open Weather API, and the only thing that is left now is we have to use this response in order to get the necessary details out of our interest, right? And I've shown you a very simple example of how to use the React Native's inbuilt network API methods in order to fire a request at the same time in order to get the response from it. Before I'm ending this lecture, I'm going to explain you a concept called promise in JavaScript. Promise is nothing but a simple analogy in JavaScript which says that given a task, I'll be calling you promisely once I have done with the task. And this is very simple terms of promise in JavaScript. And if you look at the fetch from the React Native documentation, fetch returns an promise, which means that fetch takes an argument which is going to be an URL of our interest, and it returns a promise which contains the data that this particular URL is going to give back. And that data you can get it via calling the then method on the returned promise object and passing this function. So this response is nothing but the data that is coming out of this guy. Okay, and that is the whole point of fetch API. I hope you guys have understood the fetch API in order to make the network API calls in React Native. In the next lecture, I'm going to explain what are the new features that is available in JavaScript 6 which we will be using in our current project to simplify our complete code. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Welcome all to the lecture named Set State What It Is. In this lecture, I'm going to explain another React Native lifecycle component called Set State, which will be affecting the rendering of any React component. So let's get started. As I was explaining in my previous lecture, any given React component initial state can be returned from a special method called getInitialState, right? So whatever you are returning from that method will be your initial state of an React component. Now there is a counterpart to this method which we call it as setState. GetInitialState, as its name suggests, it returns or called only once when your React component is being constructed by React component engine. Okay, in order to change your state of your component when the time progresses on in your application, you have to use another method called setState. So the idea of setState is to change your state of your component. Let me show you an example so that you will have a better understanding what I'm trying to explain. So we have our handle input text that we have built till our previous lecture. So instead of printing that to a console, I'm going to call response.jsn. This response.jsn will return the exact response that is coming from the URL. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind the next promise call with another lambda expression. And this time I call as response.jsn, start the lambda expression, and note that if your lambda expression having more than one statement, you have to wrap it with your open and close curly braces. That is required, or else your JavaScript engine is going to give you an error. Unlike in the first case where we had only one line, in second case we will be having more than one line. So if that is the case, you have to wrap up your statement within open and close curly brace. Now what I'll do is I'll show you the setState function. I'm calling this dot setState, and I'm going to change the state of our weather project. Now note that, or look at your getInitialState, we have an object with property called forecast which has another object. Now let me go and change this forecast object. Let me change only the main key of that forecast object to something changed. Okay, let me save this. Let me refresh my project in my iOS simulator. Note that the initial state of my application is the initial state that I am returning from my getInitialState function of my React Native component. Now let me go and type few pin code, and I'm going to press enter. The moment I'm going to press enter, as we have already seen in our previous lecture, this function is getting called because we have binded this function as the event listener to our text input. The moment it getting called, we know we have already hitting our network APIs from open weather application and getting the current weather application, and we'll be getting the response to JSON and again calling an yet another promise block, which I'll be explaining what it does in a moment, and in which I'm changing the state of my weather project into something else. So I'm going to press enter. We'll see what is going to happen. Now you can see that my view got re-rendered. That's exactly what we want, and that's exactly setState is doing. Now from the documentation, setState specifies that it changes the state of any given React Native component, and at the same time, after changing your state, it's going to re-render your component view, which means that the moment I'm going to call setState and does change the state of your React Native component, React Native engine by default calls render function, which will be re-rendering our complete view. and that's exactly what we want in our application, right? You can test it out several times. The moment you get the response from your network API calls, and the moment the React native engine sees that there is a set state and there is a change in your object state, it's going to re-render your view. Now, before I'm going to close this lecture, I'm going to explain two more important things. As I was explaining in my previous lecture, fetch returns a promise, and in order to get the value out of that promise, you are using dot then, right? And similarly, dot then will be also can return a promise. Okay, in the first line, what I'm saying is response.json, and this guy is going to return me another promise, so that in order to get the value of this promise, again I have to listen with another then method, which is what I'm doing over here. Okay, this is one thing that I want to explain to you guys. And the second thing, the reason that I have introduced to you the lambda expressions in ES6 syntax is, if you have done a lot of JavaScript programming, you know how awkward this keyword can refer to depending upon the calling function context, right? But with introduction of ES6 lambda expression, it says that it always keep the this to its enclosing function definition, which means that this now represents to weather project rather than to something else, which ES5 is been doing many times down the line. And that is the whole benefit we are getting out of using ES6 lambda expression. I hope you guys have now very solid understanding on the state, what is meant by initial state and what is set state, how changing your component state will be affected in re-rendering your component. I hope you guys have understood that very thoroughly. And in the next lecture, we'll be try to close this sample project. Until then, see you guys. Thank you. Hello all, welcome all to the lecture named Merge Everything. In this lecture, we are going to finish up our weather application project that will be running very good in our IO simulator. As we have now have the knowledge of how to use React Native Network API, and at the same time we now know what is set state is and how the change of any component state will re-render the view. By having this knowledge base, let us go and finish our final pieces that are required for our React Native app to be working perfectly in an IO simulator. So let me go and change the code. As we have already explained, this response.json is the response that is coming from the OpenWeatherApp API by taking the zip, which is nothing but the user input pin code. Let me go and quickly log it in the console so that we'll see what response does our OpenWeather API is providing to us. So let me save this file, open up IO simulator, press Command plus R, refresh the project, go to Xcode, delete all the logs, and let's say I'm running my state pin code and pressing enter. Now you could see that a JSON response got printed, which is what OpenWeather API is giving back to our program. Now copy that complete response and open any one of your favorite browser and go to its console to inspect what exactly JSON we got. So create an object with any name you like and say var of a is equal to paste the response and press enter. Now you can type a or the variable name that you have given and press enter to inspect the object in a more precise manner. As you can see, the object has a weather which in turn has an array. This is our interest because this array has the expected details of the current weather location of the given pin code. So let us see what can be there in the array. weather is an array of object which has certain properties like descriptions and main. Descriptions say what it's exactly happening at the current location, and main is giving you the overall picture. So that is exactly right. Over here in my place it is raining, so it's correct information for our weather application. Now, having understood the syntax or the format of our weather API response, let us go to our application and bind that with our code. Now, instead of hard coding the value into the main of our forecast object, let us go and change that to response.json dot weather of 0 dot what is main. Main is already represented as main over here, so main. Now let us save this file, open your iOS simulator, refresh it, type your zip code 600002, enter, and you can see that our forecast detail got changed from the hard-coded value to what the OpenAPI returns as a result. Now let's do the same for other properties of our forecast object. So description, we'll do the same, dot weather of 0 dot description. Again, you can inspect in the browser. It has a key of description, so you can map it directly. And the last most important thing is temperature. So in OpenAPI's response, the temperatures is available in an object called main, which looks like this, which says the temperature, pressure, humidity, and the minimum and the maximum temperature for that particular day. But in our interest, we are interested only in the current temperature, which is nothing but 87.8. So let me go and do that. Main.temp, save your JavaScript file, reload your project, and again type 600002 and press enter key. And what happened? Okay. Oh, sorry, you have to use response.json.main.temp, and looks like that's what made our application to be broken. Now let us refresh it, 600002. Now press enter, and here we go. The necessary information of our given pin code is being displayed in our application, right? And that brings to our end of our building application. Now, if you have noticed very much clearly, the initial state of the application looks like this. What is this? This is a dummy data that we have started with our project, but in order to our application to be very user friendly, this is not acceptable. It says forecast details main and current weather as dummy. What is 37 or 36 Fahrenheit? We will be fixing this part in the next lecture, and which will come to the end of our building weather application in React Native. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to this lecture on fixing the final issue. In this lecture, we are going to go through the complete code walkthrough of fixing the issue that we found in our previous lecture. Let me show what the issue is once again. Let me open up the iOS simulator, refresh your project. The moment the iOS application is getting launched, you can see that we are displaying a dummy data which is not necessary for the first time the application is loaded. So this is an issue in our application. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to fix this issue. So let's get started. So the reason why this particular data is getting printed on the iOS simulator is because we are setting up our forecast initial state object to a dummy value. Rather than that, we have to set that to null. Okay, so that it's not getting displayed at all. But if you set this forecast to null, then this line will be failing, because when the first time the application is getting loaded, forecast is an empty object with null reference, rather than having main description and temp keys. So this line will literally error out. Okay, so we have to protect our variable forecast, which is pointing to the forecast component. The way to do is very much straightforward. Let me assign the forecast also to null, and then using our this.state property, I'm going to check whether the forecast is null or not. If it is not null, then I'll be setting the forecast is equal to this particular forecast component value. Now that should fix our issue. I've saved this file. Let me open up the iOS simulator and press Command plus R to refresh the project. Now you can see that we are not getting any dummy data because we have made our forecast to null. Now let us quickly test this. Let me go and give 600002 the pin code of my area. Press enter, and now you can see the data is coming up. Let me change that to another state, 56100, and which is also changing the necessary information on the view. I'll walk through the steps now it's happening in order to prevent our bug. Okay, before our fix, forecast was pointing to a dummy data object. Now we have set it as null. So as we have previously seen in our lectures, any React Native component first method that is getting called is nothing but get initial state. So get initial state method is getting called before even render is getting called. Keep that in mind. And it's returning to an object which has two key. One is margin, another one is forecast. And I'm saying that forecast is null now. And then the render function is getting called. And I'm checking that if this dot state dot forecast, which in this case will be equal to null, I'm skipping the forecast into its forecast native UI element, which will eventually fix our bug. So this is how the first time the UI element is being rendered. So forecast will be still referring to null, so that we won't be seeing the forecast component in our iOS simulator at all. So that's exactly what happening when you launch your application for the first time. And the second time you're going to change your pin code and press enter, you know that this method is going to get called. Inside that we are doing a network API stuffs and then setting our components state using the method setState, which in turn will call the render method as I was explaining in my previous lecture. Now this .state.forecast will be already set according to the values that we are getting from an OpenWeather map API. Now this is not equal to null. Now what happens is forecast is now initialized to our forecast UI component or forecast React component, and then we are returning the view which includes forecast. In this time it's not null, it is referring to the forecast detail, and all the properties from our state is getting passed on to the forecast, which is what will be happening if you press enter. Obviously this is a wrong pin code, so it would have been a dummy response. If you give a valid pin code, you can see that we are getting the expected result. And that's bring us to our end of our lecture. So we'll be meeting you in the upcoming lecture of this course. Until then, it's bye from Anto. Have a great time ahead. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the lecture name Improve Our Usability. In this lecture, I'm going to explain what we are going to do in this particular section. And I've opened our application that we have built till now in iOS simulator, and our application is so simple. At the same time, it have taught us the React Native fundamentals. For now, our application gives or takes the user's pin code. On the moment the user presses enter key or return key, it's going to hit or do a network API stuff and bring up the current weather search results. But any application on the earth should remember at least a part of a user data, isn't it? And our application doesn't even remember the pin code. Our application forces our user to re-enter the pin code again and again. Why that should be the case? What if our application remembers the previously entered pin code that the user is searched for? Isn't that cool? And that's exactly what we are going to see in this particular section. We're going to see how using React Native's inbuilt async storage, which is an API which React Native provides in order to deal with this sort of problems. So this section we will rework on an application logic in order to maintain the user state of the entered pin code so that our application remembers exactly what the user have entered previous time, even if the user quits and opens the application. So let me show you how the end result of this particular section looks like. So this is very fundamental. 600002, press enter, and it hits the network API and gives back the result. And let me close this up and let me go and open it up again. Now you would notice that our application will be remembering the previously entered pin code value, and it's just ready to go in the state. That's exciting, isn't it? Because now the user just need to press enter, bang, we're with the exact result. And that's exactly what we are going to build in this section, and this is a bit advanced section. Stay tuned. Thank you. Hello all, welcome to the lecture name Storing Our User Data Using React Native Inbuilt API. In this lecture, I'm going to explain you the basic API which React Native is bundled along with it in order to store any sort of user related data from our application. So let's begin. I've already checked out the code. The branch name is data issue fix. In case you got stuck up with somewhere, you can go to my Github repository where I've given the information in earlier videos. Go out over there and check out the branch name data issue fix, and you can simply go to the parent directory, run npm install, and you can start your iOS simulator from Xcode, and you should be seeing a UI like this. So our UI is so simple as nothing but before it's going to take a pin code and it's going to give us the desired output. So in this lecture, I'm going to teach you the fundamental of how to store this specific pin code into React Native's safest data place. So let us begin. So in order to store our user data, we need to first pull out React Native's inbuilt storage, which React Native documentation called it as async storage. So let me go out over and pull it. Let me going to name that as async storage is equal to require. It's from the React Native bundle itself. So I'm pulling out React Native, and then I'm asking React Native to pass on me async storage, and this single line will pull out the async storage inbuilt API from React Native world. Once that has been pulled out, you can use that in order to store the data. So we need to see where we need to store the data, right? Typically, we need to store the data when the user presses enter, because imagine the scenario, our application user will be opening up this application and then entering a pin code of his or her own location and checks the current state of the weather, and he or she closes the application. So we need to put up this information when the user presses the enter or the return key. So that's the location we need to put our async storage code right away, right? So handle _handle text change is the exact location where we have to use our async storage APIs. So this is where we are setting the state of our forecast object. So before I'm going to set the state of the forecast object, I'm going to use the recently pulled async storage API from React Native to store the user entered zip code, or what you call as pin code. Okay, so doing so is so simple. Async storage dot multiset. Okay, so multiset is an API which is going to accept two parameters. The first parameter is the array, which it's going to remember. Okay, and second parameter is the error handler. So let us go and quickly design our error handler. So in order to design an error handler, I'm going to use ES6 expression, lambda expression, to make our code concise. So I'm going to write a very simple lambda expression which you are already familiar with right now. So I'm going to check if there is an error. I'm just going to simply throw the error. That's it. Now, the interesting part of storing our user related data happens in the first parameter of multiset method or function. So the multiset function or method takes the first parameter, an array of arrays, which means that it will be parsing this array, the outer array, and then store each of the inner arrays inside the React Native data async store, right? So in this case, we have only one data to store. So let us go and store that in a single array. So this single array over here should have a key and value pair. In our case, let me go and give the key as pin code, and the value of our key is nothing but the zip that exactly we are passing to our fetch API, and press Command S. That's it. This single line assures that our user-related data is being stored within React Native world very safely. And let me go and quickly refresh my iOS simulator and check we didn't break anything from our user requirement. So I'm going to redo the same and everything works exactly the same. Now the question is, it's been stored, right? But how do we get back the data? Storing isn't interesting, right? We have to get back the data and automatically populate this field from our async storage remembrance. So where we need to put and how we need to put will be covered in the upcoming lectures. So till then, it's bye from Anto. Hello all. Now given the fact that we have already written the code for storing our data, in this case the user entered pin code, in this lecture I'm going to cover or show you how to get the value that we already stored in our async storage from React Native's inbuilt API. The first question that we need to answer over in this case is, at what point of the time we need to get the data out of the async storage. And that exactly leads us into another React Native's lifecycle method, which React Native called it as component did mount. So this component did mount will be called before your view is being displayed on your iOS simulator. And as you can now sense that before even this zip code text box or before even the complete UI is being shown up in your mobile application, right, we need to pre-fill the already remembered user data. So component did mount is an exact location where we need to insert our logic of getting the data from our async storage and manipulating our UI view before even it's getting rendered onto the device, and that's exactly they name it as component did mount. So let me go quickly and create that method, component did mount, and inside that method let me go and show you how to get the data that we already stored from our async storage. So it is so simple, you might would have guessed it right now. So instead of calling multiset, you have to delete that part and call multiget, and that's it. So inside the multiget you have to pass the key that you have to interested in order to get the data out of React Native world, and multiget takes two parameters. The first one is the key and second one is a function. Again, I'm going to create the function using using ES6 lambda expression. This function takes two parameters, error and a value. For now, we don't need to worry about error. So if error, we can say throw of error, or else we will just for now will go and print the value that we are getting, which is nothing but the val. The first parameter is error and the second parameter is the val, and the first parameter to the multi-get method itself is nothing but our key of our data, which as an app developer we are interested in. Now let us save this file, open our iOS simulator, refresh your application. Nothing changes, that's good because we have not broken anything right now. Now let us go and do 600002. Enter. Now everything works perfectly fine. Now let me show you quickly that how our data as we have intended have been stored in the React Native respectively. So let me go and open the Xcode. Let me go and clear the logs. Now our requirement is to store the user entered data in this area, which is nothing but the pin code, to remember even if our user closes or quits the app. Now imagine user's phone is got switched off. Now he's going to bring up his phone after an hours of charging and his phone is booting up. Now he's opening up by that project. Now you can see in the console that this little async storage still remembers our expected data, and that's exactly what we want. And that's exactly how a beautiful applications like Facebook or even GitHub application on the market remembers your username and password that the user enters. And in this case, we are just remembering the pin code, but however, the logic remains the same. That's exactly what we want. But still, this pin code needs to be displayed over here, and that's exactly we are going to cover in the upcoming lectures. So now we have seen how to set the data in async storage using this little guy called multiset, and at the same time I've shown you how to get the data from async storage, in this case multicate using method, right? And let me show you the other steps in the upcoming lectures. Thanks for watching. Hello all. In our previous lecture, we have written our code in order to get the data from our async storage. But the data that async storage is returning is an nested array. And dealing with nested array is really a pain in JavaScript development. But there are libraries out there which have already solved this specific problem of handling day-to-day JavaScript problem. And one such library, what everyone knows and it's very popular as well, is called Lodash. So let us go and quickly install Lodash in our project. So let me go and do npm install of Lodash -- save, which is going to install the Lodash package from the npm repository into our project. This simple command also changes our package.json file and adds the dependency Lodash in the dependencies area of our package.json, which means that we can freely just transform our package.json file to other folks so that they can look what our project dependencies are. Now, given this fact that we have installed Lodash, let us go to our code and quickly check out or pull out the Lodash in our code base. So let me call it as require of Lodash. Now, in order to convert this nested array into an object, which as JavaScript developers are very familiar with, Lodash comes up with an inbuilt method called zip object. So let me go over here and change this one into an object. So instead of doing console log of directly the value, I'm going to do underscore. In this case, I'm referring this underscore to the Lodash library because I've already included the Lodash library in the name of underscore. So underscore dot zip object, which is a method that is inbuilt in Lodash library, which is going to convert your value into an object. Let me go and save this. Let me open up Xcode, remove the previous log, delete those things, and come again and refresh it. Now here we go. Our nested array is being converted into a JavaScript object, which as JavaScript developer we are familiar with. Now we can easily access this using our favorite dot notation, and that's exactly what we are going to do and show other tricks in the next lecture as well. Thank you. Hello all. Now given the fact that we have our data in a proper structured way of object in order to access our pin code, and we are ready to go now and tie up our stored data to our view, in this case nothing but text input. And in this lecture I'm going to show you how exactly we are going to achieve this specific task. In order to achieve this specific task, again I'm going to ask help from our favorite method called getInitialState. I'm going to add one more key called pin code. Initially I'm going to set that pin code as null, and Now I'm going to the render part of text input, and I'm going to say that, hey text input, your value is nothing but which is getting stored in the state, which is named as pin code. I'm going to save this file, open up iOS simulator, refresh it, and try some entering a pin code value. Press enter or return key, and you should be seeing the application works as expected and everything looks great. Now, as I've already shown that we have our data in async storage and component mount is the exact place to put our data, we need to now just set the state over here, which is going to reflect the text input rendering part. So let me go quickly and show you how to do that. So I'm going to pull out the zipped object from Lodash library by passing the value that I'm getting from async storage multi-get method. Now, once I have this, I can go safely and do a this.setState and change the state of the pin code key to object.pincode. Remember that our object.pincode is nothing but the pin code that the user have entered in the previous step. Now save this file, go over here, refresh it. Now you can see that already 60002 is being remembered by our async storage friend, and that's exactly what we want. Now the user no need to type his or her pin input again and again, just close the application and reopen the application anytime on earth he or she wants, and they'll be surprised or happy to see that as an app developer we are remembering their preferences, and that's a very good news for us as well. Now it's just a matter of pressing a return key and everything works. But if you notice carefully, there is a little issue that we need to fix before even we are going to say we have done with this task. If you try to delete some of the input from this text box, you can see the cursor is moving, but still the value is getting replaced. The reason because this issue is coming up is due to we have not changed the state of our component which is set over in this function. Remember that when I was explaining the concept behind the component did mount, I did mention that this little method will be called only once even before your view is being rendered on the screen. So once this is been set it up, and we are in trouble because we didn't change the state at all. In order to fix this very small issue, it's easy. So we have to do on change of text and assign a little function. In this case, I'm again going to use our little lambda expression and change the set state using setState API and say that our pin code is nothing but the text. Press Command S, refresh your application. Now try to delete it and everything works. Now let me go and give you some other pin code. Press enter. Now refresh the application. Now still our app remembers the user entered data, and that's a bit of an improvement to our application. In the next lecture, I'm going to give you a short recap on what we have done in this particular section and also the future lectures that are being cooking up for you. Thank you.